The Federal Reserve, the cornerstone of the American economy. The Fed has been responsible for supervising the U.S. financial system for more than a century. However, even though its job is to provide oversight, it does not have a perfect record itself. Moreover, the Fed has such a unique and complex structure that it is extremely difficult for many people to truly understand what it is. For this reason, it is not surprising that the Fed has been linked to many different conspiracy theories, ranging from claims that it belongs to the Rothschild family to assumptions that it is controlled by reptilians. Today, we are diving into the depths of American financial history to see how the Fed was created, how it works, and who really owns it, while also shedding light on many of the conspiracy theories that surround it. In the late 19th century, America faced rapid westward expansion, industrialization, and deep divisions caused by the institution of slavery, making it a nation that experienced a truly turbulent period during that century. The Civil War was undoubtedly devastating. However, even during the period of peace that followed, America suffered from recurring economic crises that left deep marks on both the country and its people, and secured their place in history. The reason behind these crises was simple. America did not have an adequate financial system. More importantly, when things went wrong, there was no central bank capable of rescuing the country and stabilizing the situation. First of all, it is important to emphasize that the concept of a central bank was not a new idea. In fact, the first central bank was established by the Dutch in 1609. This move played a major role in transforming the Netherlands from an ordinary and relatively unimportant country into a global economic empire. Following the Dutch example, the English established the Bank of England in 1694, and as expected, this institution became the backbone of the British Empire. In America, 2 attempts were made to establish a central bank despite public opposition. In fact, the first effort was led by Alexander Hamilton himself in 1791. However, in both cases, the systems lasted less than 20 years and failed to effectively manage the federal government's finances or bring stability to the monetary system. Considering all of this, the situation was extremely bad. At that time, even the failure of a single local bank could cause panic across the entire country. People knew that if a bank collapsed, no one would be there to save it. As a result, as soon as rumors of failure began to spread, people rushed to withdraw their money from banks, pushing even reliable and financially healthy banks into bankruptcy, simply because of fear and panic. These bank runs occurred with frightening regularity, and the economic depressions that followed were often long and painful. American bankers were, of course, fully aware of the poor condition of the banking sector. One of the leading American bankers of the period, Paul Warburg, stated in 1907 that the American banking system was roughly at the same level as 15th century Italy or Babylon in 2000 BC. Not long after Warburg made these comments, only a few months later, the country experienced the Panic of 1907, which had extremely serious consequences. If we turn our attention back to the beginning, the earthquake of 1906 destroyed nearly 80% of San Francisco. The effort to remove the damage left behind by the disaster, combined with ongoing reconstruction projects, made capital extremely scarce. At that time, it was difficult to speak of metal coins in circulation. Most money existed in paper form, which made distribution across the country much more difficult. A banker attempted to take advantage of this situation by manipulating the stock price of the United Copper Company on Wall Street. Although he hoped the value of the shares would rise, the opposite happened, and the stock collapsed, dragging the entire market down with it. In fact, this banker had connections with 10 different banks on the East Coast, and when people assumed that these banks were also failing and began withdrawing all their money, banks started collapsing one after another. Soon, even banks with no connection to him began to fail. Panicked American bankers turned to the only man powerful enough to save them, J.P. Morgan. At that time, John Morgan was the undisputed ruler of Wall Street. To help you understand the extent of his influence, it is worth noting that even today, the bank he founded remains one of the largest in America. Morgan was not the richest man in America at the time. That title belonged to John Rockefeller. However, Morgan was the person everyone turned to when things went wrong. In October 1907, Morgan gathered the most important bankers of the era in his office at 23 Wall Street. Using capital provided by the largest American banks, Morgan organized the rescue of reliable banks that had been pushed to the edge of collapse by unrealistic fears. The Panic of 1907 was not simply about the failure of a few banks. The crisis revealed how fragile the financial structure behind America's economic growth really was. At that time, the United States was beginning to become one of the world's largest industrial economies. Railroads connected every part of the country. Factories produced more goods every year, and millions of people were moving from rural areas to cities. However, despite all this economic growth, the financial system remained fragmented and disorganized. There were thousands of different banks across the country, and most of them could operate only within the states where they were located. A shortage of liquidity in one region could not easily be solved with excess resources from another region. As a result, even a small problem could quickly turn into a national crisis. While the major economies of Europe had already begun using central banks to promote financial stability, America continued to leave its banking system largely at the mercy of market forces. After the crisis of 1907, many politicians and economists began to argue that if America wanted to act as one of the world's leading economic powers, it needed a more modern financial infrastructure. The issue was not simply saving banks. The real challenge was creating a mechanism that could prevent similar crises from occurring in the future. For this purpose, Congress established the National Monetary Commission in 1908. The Commission's task was to study central banks around the world and develop a suitable model for the United States. Members of the Commission traveled across Europe and closely examined the Bank of England, the German Reichsbank, and other important financial institutions. The conclusion of their research was striking. Nearly all major economies had central institutions capable of providing liquidity during times of crisis. The views of Paul Warburg became especially influential during this period. Having extensive knowledge of the European banking system, Warburg argued that the main reason America remained vulnerable to financial crises was the lack of central coordination. According to him, although the country had entered the 20th century economically, its banking system was still operating with methods from previous centuries. However, the idea of a central bank was not easily accepted. For many Americans, a powerful central bank was not a symbol of financial stability, but rather a symbol of increased power for financial elites. Because of previous experiences with central banks, a significant portion of the public worried that Washington and Wall Street would become too closely connected. As a result, any new system had to balance the influence of both the government and the private sector. The complex structure that the Federal Reserve would later adopt was largely the result of this political compromise. The system would neither be completely controlled by the government nor entirely managed by private banks. The main reason the Federal Reserve still looks different from other central banks today is this careful search for balance during its creation. Once the panic had passed, it became clear to almost everyone that a central bank was necessary, and Congress immediately began working on legislation to create such an institution. The only point on which everyone agreed was that a central bank was needed. However, the details of how this central bank should operate led to long and intense debates, blocking almost every attempt to move forward with its creation. For example, the agricultural South feared that a powerful central bank would give Washington and Wall Street too much influence over their affairs. Bankers, on the other hand, wanted the central bank to remain free from political manipulation and as independent from Washington as possible. The existence of so many competing interests made the creation of a central bank extremely difficult. It took 5 full years for these negotiations to be completed. What is even more interesting is that these negotiations did not take place in Congress, but on Jekyll Island in Georgia, about 600 miles south of Washington. This resort area was home to an exclusive club whose members included more than 100 of the wealthiest people of the era, including John Morgan. As might be expected, only a small number of individuals would shape the actual plan for the central bank, while the law itself would not be passed until 1913. The newly created Federal Reserve clearly reflected the fact that its structure had been built through extensive negotiations. In order to satisfy the various interests within the United States, the Fed was designed as a central bank unlike any other in the world. First of all, contrary to popular belief, it was not a single bank. Instead, it was a network of 12 regional banks, each managed by local bankers and business leaders. Some of these banks were located in obvious financial centers such as New York and Chicago, while the locations of others were determined largely through political considerations. For example, because a senator from Missouri held a critical vote for the passage of the legislation, Missouri became, and remains to this day, the only state that contains 2 Federal Reserve banks within its borders. To satisfy Washington, these 12 regional banks were connected to a single board of governors, consisting of 7 members appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. To limit presidential influence, each governor was given a 14-year term, and the president could appoint only one governor every 2 years. However, the feature that truly makes the Fed unique, and for this we can thank and credit John Morgan, is that each regional bank is structured as a private corporation with its own shares. The system works as follows. Every nationally chartered bank in the United States is required by law to invest 6% of its capital in its regional Federal Reserve Bank. In return, that private bank receives an equivalent number of shares in the regional reserve bank. These shares are very different from the shares of publicly traded companies. Their price is fixed at $100 per share, and they cannot be sold or transferred. They represent roughly 2/3 of the voting rights in the board of directors of a regional reserve bank. However, as we know, the real power lies with the board of governors appointed by the government. Nevertheless, these shares provide a fixed annual dividend of 6%. What is particularly noteworthy is that this dividend does not give banks the right to share in the Fed's profits. Instead, everything the Federal Reserve earns above this 6% distribution is transferred directly to the U.S. Treasury. Considering that the Fed is an extremely profitable institution, this amount is substantial. For example, in 2017, while the Fed paid only $14 billion to the ordinary banks that held its shares, it transferred $80 billion to the Treasury. This naturally raises an important question. Who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve? At its core, they are all the major banks in the United States. It can be said that the complete list would fill around 150 pages. However, almost every familiar name can be found on that list. The interesting part is that most major American banks are publicly traded companies. In other words, anyone who wants to benefit from the Federal Reserve's unique structure can do so by purchasing shares of American banks. Since ownership within the Fed is linked to capital, the larger the bank, the larger its ownership stake. Therefore, the most logical place to start is at the top of the list. So the answer is far simpler and more ordinary than the theories mentioned at the beginning of this text. It is neither the Rothschild family nor reptilians. Instead, it is familiar American banks such as J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Citibank, whose shares can be freely bought and sold on the stock market. Furthermore, a large portion of these banks' profits ultimately returns to the public through the Treasury. As a result, the Federal Reserve is neither entirely a government institution nor an ordinary private corporation. It is precisely this unique position between the two that makes it a complex and often misunderstood organization. Even though the operations of this multi-billion-dollar institution are documented in publicly available records, most of us never take the time to understand it. Yet, understanding the Federal Reserve means understanding not only economics, but also the complex relationship between money, power, and government. If you do not want to miss similar content about economic and financial history, do not forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. In the next video, we will explore another story hidden behind the modern financial system.